Coming up today on the Dawnversations with Anthony podcast.
Like you're given feedback that you're not good at
Yeah.
learning, right? Which is
Yeah.
not
Mhm.
true. It's just not made for you. So oftentimes as adults, especially our age, we were told like you're not good at this, you can't do this. So you have like you start to avoid things that make you anxious because you can't hold them in mind in the same way, right? Like cleaning your room becomes anxiety provoking because I don't know where to start.
Welcome to another episode of Dawnversations with Anthony. Today we have a very wonderful guest, Dr. Anna Levy-Warren. Welcome, doctor. So happy to have you here.
Thank you.
And if you could kind of give everybody the rundown of why you're here today. We're going to talk about ADHD, but can you tell them your background?
Sure thing. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I really focused on strengthening executive functions and working with kids and adults with complex neuropsychological profiles and emotional obstacles to learning. I've been doing that for about 20 years, but I'm also in really exciting news as an expert first, but then I also became a parent of kids with complex ADHD, and it
Mm.
turns out it's genetic, and my co-parent is also someone with ADHD. So I have been brought to my knees personally and really had to grapple with what it means to be both a professional in this space and someone who's dealing with it in my day to day. So
Yeah.
I think that's actually really significant to this conversation. So I'm really excited to be here and share.
Right, because you're getting like on the job training every day at home.
Yeah. And feedback, so much feedback about what I think I know.
Well, I wanted to start off. I do not think anything about it is funny,
Mhm.
but I have always kind of self-diagnosed myself, and Anthony and I have kind of joked about it that we feel like maybe this is something that we struggle with. So my very first question that I want to make sure I get answered is, how do you know if, because I wrote down some of the symptoms or, the how
Traits.
traits. Thank you, Anthony. I have all of those traits. So
Mhm.
how do you know if you are dealing with ADHD?
I mean, my official answer to that, right, is that you'd have to go see someone who can diagnose you, right? So
Yeah.
that's the formal answer, right? And that can be actually with ADHD, that can be a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and there are other mental health professionals that can do that diagnostic picture. And it has to be that it is in multiple settings also, which is important. Some people are like, oh, I'm just such a mess at home or I'm such a mess at work, but it can't actually be just one environment specific. And some people go and get a full neurocognitive assessment and battery, but
Yeah.
I will, that's my official line.
Yeah.
Sure.
And my unofficial is when you look at that kind of list of symptoms, both from the DSM, which is sometimes where and online, I would not be using someone's personal stories, but there are lots of practitioners putting the sort of symptom profiles online and telling you what it means to have significant ADHD. And I think that that you do tend to have a feel for yourself in that way and to get feedback from your environment. And it is something that you should go check, but that symptom list, includes having challenged executive functions. But should I give a little bit of like the core underlying stuff for executive functions
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That'd
that?
be great.
So, at the end of the day, when people talk a lot about executive functioning from the standpoint of this is what I struggle with sort of organizing and sequencing, but at a brain level it's actually sort of an umbrella term for an interrelated set of cognitive processes, and it's like the air traffic control of the brain, and it's really about working memory, self-control, and mental flexibility. And so I just want to give like a quick snapshot of
Yeah.
what those mean. So working memory is like your housing and retrieving system. It's like the post-it note system in your brain. So John and Anthony too, if you both are not good at this, for example, you wouldn't want to be a server at a restaurant without a pad, right?
Mhm.
Right.
People, when you go around the room and they take your order, and they're just those people who look at you and they're like, give me your order. You're like, I'm gluten-free and dairy-free and I'm vegan and whole food.
Right.
They're like, I got you, and then there's the person who's like, wait, did you say
Yeah.
Diet Coke? And you're like, no, no, I said Sprite. And they're like,
Right.
Diet Pepsi, and you're like in this exchange, like this is not going well.
Right.
Working memory, it's not short-term or long-term memory. It's sort of that your capacity to take information, use it quickly and like stick it back out in your brain. So that's one part of it. And then self-control is really much more about self-regulation, self-monitoring, and delayed gratification, which I think are more sort of understood terms, and then mental
Yeah.
flexibility, which is like flexible thinking and transitions. So even though it's called like an attentional disorder, what we mean by that isn't just, can you pay attention to something? That's not actually what we're talking about. It's
Okay.
really about this is organizing and sequencing, and the manifestation of it that's most common are like time management issues, prioritization issues, focus and distractibility. So oftentimes people talk about time blindness as a part of this. Like, are either of you people, so I know this is crazy, but like I could be getting a massage and you could wake me up in the middle and I'd be like, it's been 27 minutes, that's not relaxing. So it's not a good thing. But
Yeah.
Right.
time blindness, who often it has an overlap with ADHD, right? There's a way in which you don't really know, you don't feel time the same way. It just doesn't move the same way. Like you're in your
Right.
process, you don't know. And so our world really revolves around time. So
Yeah.
that's one of
Right.
the things people feel most. Does that give you like
It
an
does.
shot?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And when I was growing up, it was ADD and now
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
ADHD. Are there levels like how
Yeah.
autism is? Are there
No, so
like
so it's really, let's talk about the system utilized to communicate these things
But
is
wait,
a
wait.
broken system. Yeah.
Can I ask something? I just want to add something because I have
Yeah.
this problem, obviously. Look at me. But Don, when we grew up, there wasn't that. I mean, I just want to, I don't want to correct you, but when you and I were in elementary school, nobody was saying you have ADD or it didn't exist, right?
right,
So,
right,
I think what's weird is our timeline today. If a child goes into elementary school today, they might be diagnosed and know they have it, and they'll live their life knowing they have it if there are issues in class or whatever. But our generation was undiagnosed, right? There weren't a lot of celiacs, there weren't ADHD people, or at least we were undiagnosed. So we're in a generation where we were never diagnosed. No one ever tested us. A teacher didn't take us to a reading, you know, source to help us. And so we're in this little undiagnosed
Mhm.
generation, which I think it's amazing that you're doing executive function for people who didn't know they had it or were never diagnosed. And you're working with children who are now being diagnosed. Do you see what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
absolutely. And I'm a part of that same generation. So there were diagnoses of ADD, but it was a much different, it was so uncommon. It wasn't talked about in the same way. And ADHD, it just has it actually makes no sense. It includes hyperactivity because there are two different forms. There's inattentive type, and there's actually three, and hyperactive type, and then the integration. Hyperactive type, because a certain percentage of people drop, kind of just get better, quote unquote, in adulthood from ADHD, and inattentive type is more common with adults than hyperactive type. Also, this doesn't make sense that we call everybody, because there's also mixed type. But if you go ahead, right, and that's why I don't want to get bogged down in the details of that because it's
Yeah.
actually not terribly significant for the treating and the conversation you'd have in your life, but there's mild to severe, which makes
Yeah.
sense. And a lot of that, as the whole DSM is organized around, which is our, our manual of talking, our translation system of these symptom profiles, and they're all limited in some way, right? It's helpful and unhelpful. But the way that we think about this is really around functionality. So that's how we know, sort of how severe something is, how much it's impacting you, right? Like, what is the behavioral consequence of these?
Mm.
So I spend a lot less time. Medication is important for diagnostic understanding because we really want to get into that and it can be extremely helpful. And I don't want to play that down in any way. But in terms of my job, which is not to medicate, I think a lot about, executive functions get challenged for everybody when they're sick and cognitively overloaded and emotionally overwhelmed. But people who have ADHD, it's a consistent sort of daily struggle. And I want to help alleviate that by thinking about how to help compensate and have skills and strategies that hold their particular challenges in mind. So that's how I think about it
Yeah.
most.
So Don, when you were in school, did you get in trouble for talking in class? Were you my whole if you looked at my educational report card, every single teacher from kindergarten up, Anthony's great. We love Anthony. Disruptive in class, can't focus, can't pay attention, disruptive, 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 right?
Right.
Talking disruptive. And
Mhm.
so I was not diagnosed. I'm assuming I had those tendencies. Now, as an adult, I've probably learned coping mechanisms with that. But Were you in that? Were you in that circle too, Dawn, as well, or no?
I talked a lot. I always have, but I always struggled with staying on task. My mom would say, clean your room. And to me, that was
Mhm.
such a broad thing to say, and then I've got old papers and I would, just that joke of squirrel, that's me. Just anything would distract me and my mom would come and check on a half an hour, and she's like, what are you doing in here? I just cannot stay on task still as an adult. I have a variety show podcast. Like, I like to talk about all the things. I like things to keep going,
Yeah.
and holding attention for me is very
Novel.
difficult. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. I want to just actually pick up on something you said. Not only just novel stimulation, which is so important for people with ADHD. It's like new, 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 squirrel, squirrel. Yes, yes.
Right. Yeah.
And you really need your synaptic like pleasure center to light up that way to stay on task in particular.
Mhm.
That's why oftentimes there are certain jobs that really call to people with ADHD and work
Yeah.
better or don't. But, I talk about this with parenting all the time that people use these broad terms like get ready for school, or start your work, clean your room. And to someone with ADHD, it's like, what?
Right.
What
Yeah.
are
Yes.
Yeah.
you talking about? And so
Yeah.
I spend so much time talking to my clients saying, when you put in your calendar, start working or do your exercise, that's not a meaningful thing. And you can't fool your brain into that. You have to break it down into its component parts so that there is no chance that you're going to avoid the initial thing because it's so easy and broken down. So you don't ever say, clean your room or even
Right.
do the dishes. You actually think about what is the first thing that I'm going to do. And then how do I make it fun or pleasurable? Like, I'm going to
Yeah.
listen to a podcast and I'm going to wash the utensils and like that at 7:20. Like, good,
Right.
perfect.
Right. Yeah. That's kind of what it feels like. It's just, it has to be like, I don't do a ton of prep work as to Anthony. He's like, don't you have a list? I don't, because to me, in order for me to stay engaged, I like to just have a conversation where I am listening to what you're saying, and then I respond. If I was sitting there and had to come up with a list, I think I would just get overwhelmed with the list and I'd end up not even paying attention to it. So instead, I just want it to be just back and forth, chit-chatting, and that's what has always seemed to work. And I was a
Yeah.
hairstylist. That's what I
I
always
love
did.
that.
So, it was like I didn't know how to do hair if I wasn't talking. It was just one thing happened together. So that I don't know. I feel like I get bogged down with the details. I'm better off just bare bones.
Well, I do actually want to break, like, let's talk about a myth buster that like to-do
Yes.
lists are a good idea with ADHD. It's actually what I call them is like a things that I don't get done list. It's a really problematic. Some people have learned to use them in sort of a daily way, and I don't take away tools that are good for people. But for you, Dawn, like that, the idea that you would make a list of all the things that you need to get done, that actually doesn't tell you when to do it or how to do it, give you an orientation. It's like it's not a map or a compass. And
Right.
it actually becomes really overwhelming. The people who do well with to-do lists are actually people who have really strong executive functions because they really like organize it internally. So you could have strong, Anthony was making like, yes,
Yeah,
I make a
it's
lot of lists. I
totally
do make a
him.
lot of lists. I
yeah,
do.
and sometimes that's actually great because it's not, sometimes for people, you have different lists and you figured out a strategy for it, or you figured out chunks of time. We all have amazing ways we cope, but I don't think for everybody to-do lists are a good idea. That's why I
Sure.
really use calendars as like a map and compass, and you think about when you're going to do it and why you're picking that time of day and how long you can last and rewarding yourself afterward. That sounds really annoying when you first think about it, but it
No.
actually is life changing when it becomes that kind of map and
Yeah.
compass. You're like, oh, now I know where I'm going.
Yeah.
Great. I don't just have a list of things that I need to get accomplished. That feels terrible.
So do you treat adults different than you do kids, or is it straight across the board? Everybody gets taught the same kind of coping mechanisms for how to deal with it.
You know,
Hey there, it's Dawn. So happy to have you here. Thank you so very much for listening, watching, however you're consuming this information. If you know anybody that would like it, please feel free to share it with them. If you're not already subscribed, please subscribe to the channel. We would love to have you here all the time. We try and share things that we think everybody would benefit from. Okay, back to the show.
One thing that's different for me about being a clinical psychologist versus just like an ADHD coach is I actually really, everything is different for every person.
Oh, sure.
I'm really looking, yes, I mean, of course, when I'm talking on a podcast, I'm happy to give things that I mostly do with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that's so important is that it really works for you and your system. And there's so much nuance in it. And also the thing about ADHD is that it has a lot of comorbidity with anxiety in particular, but also depression, because you're told, Anthony, about your whole life, like you're given feedback that you're not good at learning. Right? Which is not true. It's just not made for you. So oftentimes as adults, especially our age, we were told like, you're not good at this. You can't do this. So you have like, you start to avoid things that make you anxious because because you can't hold them in mind in the same way, right? Like cleaning your room becomes anxiety provoking because I don't know where to start.
Right.
So you really have to grapple with like, for example, some people say start with the hardest thing for work or for homework. And I'm like, not if you're anxious. Don't do that. Then avoid starting. Then you got to procrastination time. So the things that I sit with are, what feels good in your system? Like also the rewards for some people, like to me, a manicure is a reward. I might not be a reward for you. Sitting there and listening to someone might not be feel good too. So you really want to find the thing and you want to just understand how your brain works so that you're really coming up with these strategies in a way that's actually really customized.
Dr. Warren, I'd love for us to get to myth busting or back to that because I think it would help people. But I want to talk about children for a little bit. My wife is a first grade teacher and has been for 20 plus years, right? And I was totally against medicating children, right? I'm just, just one of those people like, oh gosh, you should never medicate children. They're overprescribing Ritalin and Adderall, blah, 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 blanket statements without knowing anything. And so my wife has had kids in her class who cannot sit, who can't finish a task, who literally cannot sit down on the carpet and listen to a story. They get up, they have to walk around. They get a little rocker chair to help them rock. They have to break things down. And so here's a bunch of children who, they're spitting in their hands and they're doing all sorts of things to occupy themselves, or they have to keep doing their things and they can't focus. And it seems like, well, those children, after hearing about a whole school year with that children potentially might aid from education from medication because they have no ability to focus for any amount of time, right? And then there's other techniques, right, where children, can be counseled and helped without medication. So am I right in that there's a spectrum and there are cases where you would say medication would help this person focus and medication, and some people with maybe a lesser degree don't need medication?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm a psychologist, but I have seen thousands and thousands of people with ADHD, and I have seen medication change lives, including in my own family, right? And you could ask me to medicate your kids, and I'd be like, no, absolutely not. And then get them to middle school where they can't sit still or pay attention or learn, and they feel bad about themselves. And I was like, just kidding. And honestly, I'll tell you, one of the most upsetting things that happened to me is one of my kids really has a reverse sleep cycle, which isn't uncommon with ADHD, and particularly a slow cognitive tempo in the morning, which is that like slow to rise. Kids idiotically, right, need to go to school by 8 in the morning.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
And she was like tortured getting out of bed. And this medication came out where it's a stimulant that you take at night called Journey, and it like came up in the morning and popped her out of bed. And I was like, this medication is my favorite thing in the whole world.
Yeah.
And so and also the problem is the medication doesn't teach executive functions. It doesn't strengthen it. So you cannot say I'm medicating a kid and expect that all of a sudden they have skills and strategies. But yes, they now can take in those skills and strategies.
Yes.
And that is the combination that can really be magical. And some kids, when you give them the toolbox and you sit and you get a really nuanced picture, don't really need the medication because they have a school program that takes them outside 6 times a day and have teachers who really like to move
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
and they keep things novel, or versus a classroom where someone's talking at you for 40 minutes and they need the medication to pay attention. So you have to see all the intersections, right? It's
Yes.
the teacher, it's about the school profile, it's about the way in which a kid learns, and all of those things factor in. So yes, the long-winded answer to is yes. It is
Yeah.
very different from
Because I
different.
think people are, they like me, they were just immediately against it, right?
Yeah.
Don't give a child medication. But my wife has said it's night and day
Yeah.
for the right people who've been medicated correctly. It goes from absolutely being unable to do, every kid in the class has 40 problems. This person can't do two on the
Right.
math sheet to now they can sit and work through the 40 problems. I mean, it's night and day, right?
Yes. Yeah, and that
But
kind of, you really can feel for kids like of our generation where they were told to sit there and do math fluency, right? Like a math minute, and it was torture. And
yeah.
then you're told you're not good at it, as if you can't comprehend. It's not a comprehension issue,
Yeah.
right? Like these
And
are.
I love your point about the negative spiral, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're told you're not good at something, or
Mhm.
you think you're not good at something, or you get negative reinforcement, you know, you start building a negative profile of yourself, which is the worst thing you'd ever want a child in elementary school to have, right? Or middle school.
Yeah, and I talk about building a positive academic self as a thing that's very important. Like you need to understand yourself as a learner. And if you give the kids the information and you say, this is how your brain works, it's different. Turns out we all have brains that work differently. So don't worry about too much. And yes, given the environment that we're in, this is a mismatch. And your brain really does work differently. And so you need to understand that and be able to say what you need. And
Mm.
I will also tell you, this is one of my favorite stories. My daughter taught me so much about having ADHD that I thought I really knew as the expert and could tell her. But there was this one amazing moment. We're driving in the car and I'm driving her, and we were listening to music together. And then she turned off the music and put it in her ears. And I was like, excuse me, I am driving and we are going to listen to this together. And she said, Mom, I have a fuel tank and it's empty. And you want me to refuel by having private time on my own.
Oh,
And I'll come back and join you when I'm ready.
That's
And
brilliant.
right. And meanwhile, I'm like, I'm an ADHD expert. I know what you need. And she's like, you don't understand what a social battery is and what it means to be alone in company. And I was like,
Yeah.
you are right. My bad. And like, there are
Yeah.
many lessons like that that she has just taught me about
Yeah. How
being.
self-aware is that
Yeah,
statement? How
right.
self-aware is that?
Yeah.
Really?
we don't let
Yeah.
kids do that enough. We don't let them tell us what it is, right? Like, Dawn, if you could say, it turns out I can't clean my room. I understand the thing you want. Could we get more specific about the
Right.
right?
Yeah.
That
Like,
bookshelf behind Dawn. For those listeners, Dawn's bookshelf is not neatly organized.
no, it's actually not.
Is do you care? I don't know.
Well, and what I would do when I had my kids is I would tell them, go pick up everything red. And so then they'd go pick up everything red and put it away. And then
Oh,
I'd say, and that was more just for me to have some kind of way of having them do it that I could keep it organized. Because if
That's
I just told them
cool.
clean, they'd
Yeah,
be like, what do you
yeah,
mean?
I think that's
How?
super clever. That's super
it is so
clever.
clever. Look, that's like, I mean, that's the thing. You just gave everybody a great tool. That's a great parenting tool
Yeah.
because it's a game and it's fun and it's novel and you'll change the color each time. And it actually is something that kids with ADHD struggle with, which is to pick out what's important from what's unimportant. And so you just
Yes.
pick the color system. Color really helps. And you just did an amazing thing
Oh,
for.
well, great. Toot toot. No, but the whole thing of overwhelm, I have and probably always will struggle with that. It's, if I open, and I love books, I read books all the time, but if somebody hands me something and they're like, this is what you need to do, I start looking and the words all start going together. And I'm just like, can you just sum it up? Can you just give me like
Yeah.
three little things that I need to take from this? I get so overwhelmed by that. And how do you talk yourself off the ledge when you are feeling that kind of overwhelm? Like, how do you know where to start?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And there are so many different versions of that. There's visual overwhelm, which is like a visual
Mhm.
processing issue, which is actually often associated with this, where you have trouble picking out what's important versus what's unimportant on a page, for example. So if somebody gives you a ton of black and white text, it's like, how do I know what to look at or what not to? And then there's
Right.
cognitive overload, which is like too much information coming in at once. But just to answer your question, right? The first thing we want to do is understand that that's real. Like, to not treat it like, oh my God, there's something wrong with you. You're so overwhelmed. It's like, yeah,
Mhm.
actually, the thing you gave me is overwhelming my brain. So
Right.
could you give it to me in smaller pieces? So this happens. Sometimes I work with lawyers who will say that they give a lot of, like, the partners when they're, low down on the totem pole, we'll give them they'll sort of like give them 17 auditory directions. And by the time they leave, they don't know what they're to do. And it's like, you need to be able to say, I'm so sorry, my brain doesn't work that way. I either have to take notes while you're talking, or could you send that to me in writing? You know,
Okay.
need to be able to say to people to use bullet points, and you need to be able to break down long-winded, like
Yeah.
transcripts of things into the most important things. And you need to use color. But the most important thing is to find the bite-sized bit that feels good to your brain. You're like,
Okay.
That's just what I wanted to know. Thank you." Like, actually, what's the summary of this? And this is where, assistive technology and AI is
Yeah,
actually really helpful. But
definitely.
you can say, could you tell me the three most important points this author is making and where I can find more information on it if I
Yeah.
want? Right? But that really helps you, Dawn, understand, like, oh, that felt just right to me.
Hmm.
And think about the working memory example I gave at the top. When you tell your kids, you don't give them multi-step directions. They struggle with that. So
Right.
Yeah.
instead you say, please go pick up your soccer cleats and put them in your bag. Great. Is that done? Could you now go get your water bottle? And then you let people take over those tasks by coming up with their own systems and learning them. As adults, we're expected to do that on our own. So rude.
Right.
But when we're parenting, we try to scaffold in a way that helps them find their growth edge, which is like their capacity to learn and feel successful in learning,
Right.
to feels like they're getting that synaptic yes, right? And that's really one of the most important takeaways. It's like, if you don't get a synaptic yes, you don't feel good and you don't want to do it again, right?
Yeah.
So
So
do a list of things and you feel overwhelmed, you're not going to want to get something from me again.
Right. No, that's
yeah.
so true.
So
God.
if you're meeting with people, let's say 45 and above, again, who there wasn't probably a good process in the educational system to diagnose them early, so they're semi undiagnosed, but they're adults and they've lived their whole lives, like Dawn and I, right?
Yeah.
Do When you talk to them, do you find that they have developed their own little workarounds unknowingly? Like I make lists of things because I won't get them done if I don't write them down. I don't put time, but I mean, like I've made my own little thing so that Dawn does use a calendar, right? She uses a calendar, she puts things on a calendar. Yeah, so I don't do that. So did we find our way around this undiagnosed and come up with our own little techniques?
Absolutely. The thing that I find most often is that something happens with adults where they have a system, but if there is disruption and they have to transition, or something is added, that's when things fall apart. So
Mm,
your system, it works good for you, and then a family member gets sick, or you have an appendectomy, or and then all of a sudden everything goes to shit. And that's that. Am I allowed to say that? I'm not sure. But the truth is that everything really goes south, and
yeah.
that really creates a problem where, if you didn't have those challenges, you might be able to be flexible in your thinking and come up with a new strategy on the spot. And instead, you think, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do. But of course, you've come up with many compensatory strategies. The other thing you do is you partner with someone who thinks, why are you doing it that way? That's bananas. It's
Yeah.
inefficient. Or you have children and then they need you and your systems aren't working. So things come up that then challenge your systems, but most adults have come up with systems that then just kind of fall apart when there's added pressure.
So you'll help an executive strengthen their set. You could look at mine and say, hey, Anthony, great that you do lists and this. But if you really want to stay on task or you're way overwhelmed at certain points, these are some strategies you could use.
Yes,
right?
exactly. And I
Yeah.
really think and this is the customized part. I'm not interested in what works for everybody. People ask me all the time, like, what's your favorite calendaring system? And I'm like, the one that works for you. And I often will talk to partners or people or roommates or whoever is giving the negative feedback often, so that we're in a conversation about impact on your environment and what it means, and so because sometimes your system, when you have ADHD, feels really good to you, but it does have negative impact on those around you. So I think really systemically, I think it's really important to understand that sort of 360 review process of how are your systems impacting the people in your life? Where are you falling down, right? Like what happens that needs scaffolding? And then we work together on creating those systems.
I love that. And especially just to me, the whole moral of the story is to any teachers, adults, anybody that's around a child that is doing things differently or not able to grasp things, there's nothing wrong with them, like to have a teacher that's so impressionable on you and say, why can't you figure this out? Or why aren't you doing it like everybody else is doing it? That's so harmful to a child because then they do grow up and be like, well, so and so said, 15 years ago that I cannot stay on task.
Yeah.
So that must be true, I guess.
So
Yeah.
pay attention is a
It's
terrible thing to say, or like you're not paying attention. It's a meaningless statement. So
it's
Right.
not a scarlet letter. I mean, it's so I think, I think there's been a time where you would feel bad about it or ashamed or embarrassed if your child was diagnosed or you were diagnosed. But I feel like it's come up in I mean, fidget spinners and things like that over the last, I
Mhm.
mean, it's come up in the nomenclature. People kind of realize it's happening. They worry about overdiagnosis, right? That
Mhm.
if you forget your keys, you have Alzheimer's, that
Right.
kind of thing.
Right.
So I'm sure you get a lot of that too, right? Like I interrupt people. Oh, you must have ADHD, right? I mean, does
Yeah.
that mean I have ADHD or do I just interrupt people and I'm rude?
You're just rude.
There are many reasons you could interrupt people. You just remember they could be boring. You just
Yeah.
That's true though.
Um,
Is there, this might be really stupid, but do you ever think about diet? Does it ever come up like for sugar intake for people, caffeine? Because I know when I have caffeine, it sets me to a whole new path. It's almost like what I think cocaine would be like for people because I'm already so bing, 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 bing. And then I have a cup of coffee and it seems like I'm completely off the rails.
Well, I mean, listen, I'm not right. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not a dietary, but do I think
Right.
things like absolutely, right? And I really do think that watching, it's a regulatory issue. So watching when you eat, when you exercise, being
mm,
super intentional about protein and what goes in your body, like all that stuff is real,
Yeah.
not a ton of like processed sugar-based food because your body takes more of a toll for it to process and your body's working real hard to get the other stuff done. And the other thing I would, so the regulatory component of it is the one that I really focus on. Like, how do
Hmm.
you more routines that are based around healthy, like healthy food. And then the caffeine thing is really interesting because a stimulant medication, right, helps with your focus. Some people find caffeine really helps with focus. Some people find it like sends them off the rails. This is where it's really individualized and it's so important to pay attention to your body and what it does. I mean, the other thing I just think is so important that we don't think about is time of day. Like, when do you need what? When do you crash? Like, we don't
mm,
we just assume, right, a lot around, we have lunch midday. I don't
Right.
lunch midday. You might need lunch at 10 a.m. But
Hmm.
yeah.
pay attention, especially with ADHD, on those kind of cyclical things.
The low blood sugar
Yeah,
drops, right? Throughout the
exactly.
day,
You
right?
crash. No, and I don't know if that there's just a bunch of research on 4 p.m. being like what most accidents happen and like don't go to a hospital at 4 p.m. because and it makes sense. It's because we crash then. It's between two big meals. We're tired by that point. So you really want to think about when you should do what during a day.
Yeah.
And really, and the other thing that I'll just say, the things that I do tell everybody as adults are to have anchors in your day where like a beginning, middle, and end. Like, is it your cup of coffee? Is it reading the newspaper? Is it saying good morning to a partner? Whatever it is, just being really intentional that you have a beginning, middle, and end that's very anchored so that there's a real grounding in time. And then routinization, which is like, for me, it's like building routines, means that there's more automaticity, which means your brain works less hard. So the more things, and I know that's for people with ADHD, they're like, but that's boring. And I'm like, I understand. If you get those things in there and you recognize them and there's automaticity, then you can add the fun stuff because you have this grounding. So I do think that those little things are really helpful for everybody. The only exception is like creatives really give me a hard time about this. They're like, I'm a songwriter and I can't know. And I'm like, you're right.
Yeah.
Then make a creative bubble and just be like, don't bother me during this time. And that's fine too.
Yeah, I think, if you handed me at work an Excel spreadsheet and said you need to figure all these numbers out at 3:30 or 4 or 5 in the afternoon, there is no way I could do that, right? It was the creative stuff, the writing the email, responding to people in the afternoon. In the morning, I would want more detail orientation kind of tasks because
Yeah.
they're too hard. They're too hard in the afternoon. I can't focus, right?
Yes, exactly. See, look at you tracking yourself. That's
Yeah.
and
Good job, Anthony.
And you've come up with compensatory strategies for yourself.
Yeah.
That's great.
Can you think of any other myth that needs busting? Something that you hear all the time and you're like, why do people think that? That is so not true.
I mean, specifically around ADHD, I think that there's this idea of it's sort of about the feeling like I need things to be changing all the time. Like it's this balancing, right? Like I need things to be novel. I need things to be different. I need to be constantly moving. It's like, yes, there is that feeling, but the feeling isn't always associated with the thing that's actually most helpful. So it doesn't mean that you should get up 100 times, for example. It doesn't, to me, people really like a movement break for children. Like people really think this is the thing they need to do is like move, they need to move a lot more. Children do need to move more, but movement breaks can be micro movements. They can be learning how to wiggle in your chair. They can be learning how to stand up and touch your toes. They can be, doing a stretch, and that's for adults too. And sitting for long periods and paying attention, quote unquote, isn't necessarily the right goal. It's how long can you pay attention for, and then cutting ahead of that, giving yourself a brain break and coming back. And remembering that transitioning back, if you like get up and get a snack, is much harder than if you do something that is like reading something or having a sip of water or touching your toes. Going on social media, not an effective break. Transitioning to and from, and that's more novel and exciting. So it's just, that's not as much of a myth buster in the same way.
Right.
A lot of ideas about what it means to have ADHD and like the hyperactivity. And it's like, I think it's more about paying attention to your own regulatory system and what you need and how to kind of bring yourself back and forth. So it's changing some of the language.
Right.
And I love that it's different for all of us too, right? That there is no one solution for everyone, and everyone has their own special diagnosis and their own coping mechanisms and things like that, right? It should be tailored to the individual, right?
I really believe that. I mean, listen, there's some researchers out there that if they heard this, they'd be like, the manualized treatments are well documented. And it's like, I'm not arguing with that. It will make significant change. Absolutely. What I'm saying is working with real adults in real life, in real situations. I just don't find many people with ADHD want to sit and do like a protocol on all the theoretical skills and strategies that they should implement. What you want is someone modeling for you, with you, in a collaborative effort to figure out, Dawn, how to straighten the books on your bookshelf if that's the thing that's important to you, not to tell you this is the way we do it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Do you find yourself in situations where, I know you can't just diagnose someone on the fly, but you're in McDonald's and you see somebody doing this, or you're at a funeral, or
I'm not going to lie to you. I diagnose all the time. And at this point, I've got it down to like, I should not. This is an unofficial commentary.
Yeah.
Not responding as a psychologist. I'm responding as a person. Yeah, I diagnose people all the time. I diagnose people based on emails. I diagnose them.
Oh no.
Because it's so, I feel it in my body at this point. I've just been doing it for so long.
Yeah.
can't make it official, I can feel it from miles away because people's brains work differently. It doesn't have the beginning, middle, and end. It's like a boom explosion and you feel it. And ADHD has an exciting component too. Like
Yeah.
you're firing in so many different ways and there's so many different creative processes and you're not going A, B, C, D, you're going F, G, Q, R, Z. So if the world weren't telling us all the time, this is the way that we need to be efficient and effective, there would be a different feeling around ADHD diagnosis.
Yeah, not
And
as negative.
yeah, and I'm not saying that it's not a disability and that it shouldn't be accommodated. That's also important in the environments that we're in to understand. But I also think that, yeah, like I can feel it shooting off people because their brains move differently.
Yeah,
Yeah,
The Holderness family, the husband of the Holderness family, has a book, right? ADHD is my superpower. Is it something like that? I think it's.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that that's, there's many practitioners who feel I really understand the complexity in this conversation because you actually really want to hold space for the importance of knowing it's a disability and a disorder and needs to be accommodated and understood that way. And there are really amazing strengths that are just different in having an ADHD brain that allows for different movement that we do want to honor. So,
Yeah.
that you can hold space for both.
I
do
have
you?
a nephew who is autistic, but he has perfect pitch. He composes music. He can memorize numbers and lists and math, and so would he struggle in a social situation with a lot of us and making eye contact and making sure we all feel incorporated and reading faces? Yes, but he does have some pretty amazing superpowers in his brain that the normal person does not, right? So it is funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's almost like a creative side to people that can think their mind thinks completely different. It takes all kinds to have us here on this earth. So what's next for you? What are you most passionate about right now? Do you have any upcoming projects or?
I'm really passionate. I've been working with a bunch of schools in the New York City area on really understanding neurodiversity in a classroom and building curriculum around strengthening executive function. So instead of seeing these individual, like, Anthony, thinking of your wife and teaching first grade, that the idea is like, how do we help a first grade classroom, both with strengthening executive functions and tolerating kids with different attentional capacities instead of being a problem-based, solution-oriented to the individual kid, which may sound different to my customized learning idea, but in a classroom, you also have to think of the teachers and you have to think about what's meaningful to them and also to the changing world and how much additional stimulation there is and speed required and
Yeah.
bottom up versus top down attention and cell phone. You have to think about all that stuff. So that's where my passion is really lying right now, is to reach more people by also helping school systems.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
and
so
one
great.
super disruptive child in a classroom takes away from the learning of all the other children, right? But you don't want to cast that child out. So again, you find techniques. Karen finds techniques, and we're lucky because there was a lot of resources, so those children get resources. But you want to figure out how they can learn and be part of the classroom, so that all day, every day, you're not just going after that kid, as what happened before these things were kind of mainstreamed into recognition, right? There was just that problem kid that got all the attention all the time, and it was negative, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, like they were naughty. They were
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
kind of that you could always I could still I won't, but I could still name the naughty little kid that went all through my grade school. He was always in the corner and he probably had some type of ADHD or something like that that just couldn't stay on task and
So, so Dr. Ward, so how would people find help, right? Let's say you do have an adult professional, in their 20s, 30s, 40s, who are having trouble focusing, or they feel like they, can't get on task, et cetera, et cetera. What would your suggestion be for them? And then I want you to do the other one with two parents that have a child, and that child is just always seems to be disruptive and they can't focus. And that's parenting 101 for, I think, everybody, but someone feels that they're in an extreme situation. What would your recommendation be for them?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think at the most basic level, if you are feeling like your kid is outside of developmental norms, or you're getting feedback from school and at home and you're frustrated, that there's a way, and that's for an adult too, like at work and your partner, like and your friends, you're like, you're always late and you're never paying attention. You can really take that in. If there's multiple settings and multiple levels of feedback coming in, then I think it's probably worth going in and sort of, seeing someone who could potentially really assess in a more serious way,
Would that be your GP? Go to your general practitioner or your
no,
pediatrician, or
actually,
go
yeah,
to more of a specialist?
I would go to more of a specialist, and or you can ask for a recommendation from your GP for a specialist.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But I wouldn't just go self-diagnosing. I think it's important to have that sort of official picture. And then in terms of support and help, there are lots of, at this point, ADHD coaches. And I just think what's important is to really look at their backgrounds and like see, because sometimes there's no real licensure or credentialing. So I prefer people work with someone who has a background in psychology of some kind, so that you have an understanding of neuropsychology. I think that's important. That can be a neurocognitive education specialist. That could be somebody who has additional training, and any kind of psychologist, PhD, PsyD will have that. So like that's how I do like to think about it that way. And then or looking at the backgrounds of people who have coaching companies, just to make sure that they really understand the way your brain works. So you're making synaptic change, internalized change, and not just being coached forever on sort of what to do.
Yeah.
You want to be
Yeah.
rendered useless as a coach. And anyone who tells you otherwise, you really want to be away, like, kind of stay away from. The other thing, I have a coaching company that's called Steele Advising for adults. Like it's basically strategic thinking and efficient, effective learning. And that one is, the sort of customized coaching for adults. And then for kids, I have Organizational Tutors, .com, which I've run for 20 years. My friend came up with the name. It was before web domains. I didn't really understand. So
Do you work with a school and they would refer people, or is it parents referring? And do you work with corporations and
word of mouth.
people have it as a benefit, or does, Joe Schmo just
Joe Schmo.
Google it, find your site,
Yeah.
and then,
Yeah, that's it. Joe Schmo, just organizationaltutors.com, and right on the nose. Just didn't know what I was doing, and really was just sitting around having dinner, and someone was like, "You should have some domain names picked out." It's like, I don't know what that is, because I'm old. That's really what happened. It's not a thought out thing, but that's advising. And I think that there's, the things I would just be careful of with kids. Like I think younger children really require, I know this does not benefit me because we're not everywhere, but I think with younger children, in-person support is really important, especially like third grade and below. So we have a number of locations, but I just want to be careful with people. And in small towns, if you really don't have access, it's fine. But I would look for people who could come to you, because there's a lot of, as it's hard to pay attention, and screens are a different thing. So
yeah.
really what comes to mind for me.
All right. Well, tell people where they can find you.
Organizationaltutors.com and steeladvising.com with 2 E's. And those are the places to find my executive functioning kind of coaching stuff, which is really about, the ADHD diagnosis is sort of that inherent in that are executive functioning challenges.
Awesome.
Right.
And I'll put all that in the show notes too. But you answered so many of my questions. Honestly, you did. And I have been so excited to talk with you, because you do feel like, is this it for me? Am I just going to be like this forever? And there's ways around it. There's ways to make yourself feel a little bit more organized and put together.
Yeah, definitely. And I will tell you that I just had a client that I saw in college. She texted me. It's like been 15 years. And she said, "You're never going to believe it, but someone just looked over my shoulder and told me I was the most organized person they know." Laugh out loud. Can you believe it?
Wow.
You really can change your brain in that way. And I just really want to support people. It's like you can really strengthen your executive function. You can really feel more organized. You can feel like you have more of a map and compass. It's not hopeless. And that's really important.
Oh, that's great. What a way to end it. Good job.
I know. My gosh.
Well, thank you so much. It was so nice to meet you, and we'll be in touch.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot. All right. So what did you think about that? I learned a lot. I thought she was amazing.
I found out that you have ADHD, Dawn.
I thought we all knew that already.
Yeah. Yeah. I tried to be on my best behavior too, like thinking that she's diagnosing us as we're talking,
Well, it is kind of a free little trick you can find
free
out.
seminar. It's like hypnosis. I can get it for free, maybe.
Yeah, no, I really did think it was interesting. And I really do think that people need to be more mindful of how they talk to children because it is like a
Yeah.
scarlet letter. It is like you feel so labeled and
Yeah.
hopeless, and it's not the case. You just have
Yeah,
to
I mean, I
learn
don't want to
different.
dismiss the adults in the room, right? Because I think if you need help or you're in a career and you feel like you're being held back because of certain things or you haven't gotten that promotion or whatever that is, I think you should go read that self-help book, go find help. But I think I worry about children. I
Yeah.
like you, right?
Yeah.
I just I hear so much of it with Karen in the classroom. And there's severe cases
Right.
and then there's just moderate cases. But the negative self-talk or the negative spiral or that kid that you mentioned that's sent into the corner again and
Yeah.
again, that kid doesn't grow up to become, a pillar of society. That kid is just getting reinforced that they're not a good person, right?
Right. Right. Which is
And
absolutely not the case.
that's so that's just bums me out that something like this undiagnosed could really hurt someone,
Well, and you think about all of the teachers out there that are like, oh my God, yeah. And they've got more students every year added to their classrooms, and then they get paid nothing to
Yeah.
teach. And
and
they're just,
and and we're lucky we have good resources where we are. You have good resources, but there's inner city schools where they just don't have the counselors, they
or
don't
the
have the reading
resources.
support specialists, they don't have that after school program or whatever that is. And the parents are working two jobs, and that's a difficult situation. And who that's trying to make rent is going to have the money or time
Yeah.
and effort to send their child to a child psychologist. It's tough, right?
Yeah,
That's
and
tough,
insurance, not everybody has great insurance, but
right?
yeah, I would say just check all your resources. If you can get your hands on a book, the library's free. Go,
Yeah.
start reading up on it. But yeah, don't label your kid, don't label your friend. I mean, I am more than happy to joke on myself saying that I'm not organized. I know my weaknesses, and it makes me feel good that she is an expert in dealing with people like me.
Yeah.
Then you don't feel so alone.
But
Like,
I
okay.
liked your parenting tools, right? So
Yeah.
so even if you're sending your kid to a place and they don't have the resources and you can't afford that, you can afford to go to the library, get
Hmm.
a book on it, find out a little bit more about it. You can't afford to find out strategies like your pick up red things strategy, which is brilliant, right? And try and use those to help your child,
Yeah.
at the
Right.
very least,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. There's resources out there, even if it's a podcast. If you're in the
Nice.
car. No, I really wasn't planning on selling the podcast, but I mean, there are ways for people that I don't have time to go to the library. Well, you're in your car, I'm sure, either driving to work, driving your kids to whatever, sitting outside waiting for their practice to be over. Use your resources, try and find things. There's people out there that want to help.
Yeah.
And it isn't a matter of bad parenting. So for people that are like, oh, little Timmy is such a brat, his parents need to, no, they're doing their best,
Yeah.
and Timmy just isn't learning like everybody else.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think she's great. I loved her sense of humor. She was
Yeah.
hilarious. She
Yeah,
had a
and I
great
love the
delivery.
fact, she specialized in it and then she has personal experience, right? So
Oh
it
my
just
gosh,
it's
yes.
just brings so much more credibility, right?
Right. She's like, I'm surrounded by it all the time. Give me
I think it's
away.
funny she diagnoses on the spot. She's in line at Starbucks and like that person over there.
Hey, I eyeball people's hair when I go to church and the store and all that stuff. You
Exactly.
can't take it out of you when you've got it in you. But anyway,
Like how many times, Dawn, have you gone through the grocery store and you go down this aisle and then you go over there and then you go back down the other
did
aisle
I
and
see what I think I saw?
you see the same person and they're like, "Why are you on this aisle like three times?"
I see
But
you.
but you're just putting things back. So
Yeah.
that's what we know.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Or Nathan is. All right. Well,
Okay.
yeah, I think it was great. I think that was good for both of us.
Yeah, she was really good.
Maybe we need to have her back on. That could be a part two. But anyway, all right. We'll see you later.
Okay, ciao.
Bye.